Hey everyone, we are back on our second episode of the second season, where we are actually exploring some specific elements that we kind of touch upon when we actually did our narrative, society's narratives or society's myths. We actually talked through um, how society viewed one another, how society viewed outsiders, how society viewed um, leadership, how society shapes the way that do certain things over and over again for a sense of identity, what we call ritual, how society viewed even the religion, supernatural, how society viewed these things and how these things shape our life and how the values of religion shapes us. And at times, even though we stand from a distance and we try to find our own personal voice, but we are immersed in this cultural current from the moment we are born into this world, because that's what it means to be human, to be born within a community, right? So the last time we met, we actually talked a little bit about um, how, as we are born into communities, we are kind of like directed to certain stories about beginnings. And these stories are massive stories. They are stories about why we are here, right? So for some, the beginnings have to do with God or gods, right? So we kind of explored this idea that the concept of God and gods may not be so much about the issue of, it may not just be about the issue of whether God or gods exist, but the function of this God or gods in our day-to-day life. Whether the function of this God or God is actually to sustain our certain functional purpose within our families or societies where, sometimes in the Asian community, it is to actually procreate or to get married. So that's part of it. So when we, for example, when some people go to the temples, that's what they do. They reinforce through prayers this desire to procreate and to have families, and that is the purpose that they have in this brief life. Or some others, when they go to their services or even church services, the emphasis is on fulfilling a certain dream. For example, the dream of starting a business or the dream of becoming successful. And whatever you think about this, the church probably lays down some steps or strategies for them to actually fulfill the inner sense of fulfillment, the inner sense of um, becoming the kind of person that they want to be, right? The self-fulfillment. So that's another kind of narrative that may spring up from a God or God kind of story, right? So because oftentimes when left alone as an individual, we find ourselves um, very insecure in a very dangerous world, because as you adult, right? So I was just talking to a friend yesterday. He was my ex-colleague. Right? So that was like maybe, I don't know, half a decade back or something, 5 years back. Yeah, or more than that. Um, I was saying that, when as we're growing up, things were just so simple and straightforward, right? So we would think that if we actually put in a certain amount of effort, we would get this in return, right? So this amount of effort will lead to this kind of consequences in return. But in reality, even if we are very competent in our work, even if we are very dedicated in our work, we face all kinds of resistance from all sorts of sources, right? It can be management, it can be our peers, it can be people we are leading. So it comes in all directions. And so often the good that we are trying to do even gets undone. So we were just talking about how life in itself is full of complexity that we cannot ignore, we cannot avoid, right? It comes at us So once again, this idea that we are born into these communities where um, this kind of social currents or even conflicts between um, different stakeholders, different people who have vested interest in certain things going for them in their life, it creates a very unsafe place, right? Unsafe as in it's not that you're going to be knocked down by a car that, I mean, but that's again a possibility, right? In a world that is dysfunctional, a drunk driver may just knock you down. That's a risk that you take every time you walk, right? But we don't think about it. But underlying the surface of our life is a lot of um fear and insecurity because we feel like we are alone. So because we are alone, we try to attach to bigger stories like the story about God, the story about how the world is created, and we try to derive a sense of meaning from those stories. We try to um, be informed by those stories because we feel like if we can attach our own identity to those stories, then it does bolster our sense of um, what we can do here on Earth. And in some sense, our life becomes multiplied in its significance and its sense of impact, right? Or we feel supported that somehow, no matter what struggle we face, there is a bigger story kind of like holding us. So all this is happening right beneath the surface when we actually go into also, our daily life. We are actually drawing strength from these sources of energy. I would call them energy, right? So, and this idea of energy, many people would think is some kind of like very fantastical or woo spiritual kind of idea. But this idea of energies is not, I mean, I'm not just referring to what um, is now very popular on YouTube, or content creators are just riding on this idea of, if you practice certain chakras, and then your body has some kinds of all these energies that relate to creativity, relate to your um, I guess, sense of fulfillment. I mean, there is some facts in that, but that's not what I'm talking about when I use the word energy. I'm just saying, where is that place that motivates you? Where is that source that helps you to support you in feeling like your life is much bigger than um, just your four walls or your echo chamber, right? And all of us inwardly, although we say, let's mind our own business, I don't bother if the world burns, right? We actually do want to feel connected. That's why, in some sense, comparison is part and parcel of the human nature, right? And a lot of things that we try to moralize and say, for example, um, just don't compare at all, right? But the fact is that we cannot just don't compare because the very um, participation in society is a form of trying to align, and alignment is to align and try to adjust who we are to others. It's a form of comparison. I mean, it requires comparison. We need to compare to know, to measure where we are vis-a-vis those around us. And obviously, there is a very unhealthy form that goes into envy and jealousy. So that's another different issue altogether, right? But um, we all need narratives that provide us energy. So where do you get that? And that's the second part of the talk that we began last week in this uh, kind of like first segment of this season, which is God and beginning. Let me share the screen and we will dive a bit deeper. Hopefully the screen is coming up. Oh, great. Yeah, so we were saying that in the Bible, in the ancient um, Judaistic tradition, Jewish tradition, you see a lot of division points. You see that the authors give the readers a lot of inner um, inner call to to action, to contemplation, to consideration, right? So there's a lot of awakening of the person's own autonomy. And this is what I find interesting, which I might explore a bit deeper for myself, right? Because a lot of times, as we say in the past, we think of God in terms of policing or enforcement, right? Where he is someone holding a gun, to your head. There's even an author that prominent Christian author that once kind of like compared self-control towards lust. So you're saying that, you know, you just have to imagine if you say that you're addicted, right? What if a terrorist is holding a gun to your head and telling you not to do something? You wouldn't do it, right? So actually you do have the self-control in that situation. So there's a lot of in underlying aggressiveness, underlying kind of intimidating push when we talk about God, when you think about how he enforces his will on our life, right? So we don't really naturally tend to think of religion or God in terms of freedom or in terms of a return of autonomy to people who were once enslaved by external things, right? And giving them back their personal voice. We always think of religion as trying to subjugate your personal voice to conform, right? Something is a tool of the community. But there's something interesting about the Jewish tradition because it kind of pulls on the person's autonomy. Things like choose you this day whom you shall serve, or this is the way, right? You hear a voice saying behind you, this is the way walking. And obviously Jesus also said to a group of people who was trying to condemn others, he was saying, if you don't repent, you will likewise perish. Right. So the idea is always to awake someone to the reality that, the world is dysfunctional. You are dysfunctional because of merit of reasons, right? Family origin, fallout of relationships, brokenness, sickness, disease, abuse, trauma. But are you taking control? Are you making choices to repent? And the word repent means to turn back from whatever that's causing you this dysfunction. Are you exploring why this dysfunction exists? There's always that kind of pushing, confronting um, the person to confront himself, right? So that's why in the prodigal son story, when the son who has squandered his father's wealth on prostitutes and um, what have you, right? Drinking, uh, gluttony, and all the seven sins, right? He came home, but before he came home, the scripture actually says that he came to himself. So there's that sense of returning to what you once knew was true, or in some sense, can I say, to your own personal voice that you may have lost because of your addictions, right? And when we think of addictions, we think of drugs or alcohol. We often don't notice the impulse that drive the addiction, right? For example, some people drink because they want to be validated by their community, by their bros, right? So there's a sense of trying to, once again, compare. Am I as connected to community as others? And because I'm not connected, I'm trying my best to expand it through alcohol, right? And that becomes alcoholism in the end. So there are impulses that drive things. For example, perhaps a person is addicted to work, and that's because it gives him a sense of distraction from the pain of the loss of a certain quality of relationships that he might have had with people around him. And work is where he, in some sense, regains a sense of, or at least in his mind, he regains a sense of freedom from that pain, where he's able to be connected to a task, whereas he cannot be connected to people. He feels connected to the task that he's doing, right? So there's that sense of you belong to a certain, once again, a bigger story beyond yourself. So that's where he draws his energies from, right? Obviously, overworking then breaks his health down, right? So there are some forms of narratives that do cause us to become dysfunctional and does not rescue us from the dysfunctionality. Sorry. from the dysfunctionality of life. Instead, they push us perhaps even deeper, right? For instance, yeah. So, I mean, I woke up today in KL because I'm here on a short vacation alone, just as I have been for the last year, right? Last 1 year, I've been to um, Bali, Ho Chi Minh alone, right? So I have spent, I mean, Ho Chi Minh with my family, but Bali alone, Malacca alone. I've spent time to really sit with um, loneliness, to sit with myself, right? And deliberately so, in trying to just perhaps put a pause on certain narratives that I have tried to use to derive identity healing and the energies to actually motivate me um, in life, right? So one thing that I noticed is that in the past I used to, um, you know, I have, and when I need relaxation, I would sometimes overspend on massages. That's what I do, right? So, and something that even that form of relaxation or therapy can become a source of an addiction, right? Because and doesn't mean that it is an addiction immediately when we have it. When we use that word, we have this idea of destruction, right? Very destructive. But in some sense, it means habits that have become so ingrown that we return to it subconsciously, and we seem to prioritize that over other forms of meaningful, uh, bigger stories in our life that we can actually consider to help us to grow. Bigger stories where we can actually find ourselves, um, and our role to play in those bigger kind of framework, or even kind of like an idea, our idea of perhaps life as an expanded journey of bringing hope to others, healing to others, healing for ourselves. We can forfeit those by going into a very straightforward, if I feel pain, I will do this to relieve myself of pain, right? Some people overdose on painkillers because of that, right? So, and it's not a simple matter, because it's not a matter again of good and bad. And that's why in all this podcast, we're trying to really demoralize actions, right? So trying to really tear the layer um, of the first layer of actions that's usually in the past traditionally deemed as this action is good, this action is bad, but we're trying to tear the first layer away and look deeper, right? So to look deeper into how actions are actually birthed from the human, and the human is not just a simple matter of a good and a bad human, but human is a mix of the memories, the experiences, the emotions, the beliefs, the values, and it's constantly evolving as it interacts with the world around it, right? So the world affects the human being, but the human being um in turn affects the world around him. So for years I have that sort of like going to massages, right? And I have to pause, and I mean, on one hand, I can just condemn myself and tell myself that, I shouldn't be going there. I should perhaps, try to do more podcasts, or try to reach out to more people who are like-minded, from communities like this where we can share openly and talk about our pain, our wounds, right? I can just push myself to that. But on the other hand, I really have to ask myself, what is the genesis of my energy, right? And in the ancient tradition, from where, at least where I come from, there's this idea of uh, death and life, right? Death and life. So in the Buddhist tradition, there's this idea of reincarnation where the cycle continues, right? And hopefully you can grow from one level, like the animal life, the human life, and then ultimately to the Buddha, right? Where you are able to, you've seen the world, you have able to see the meaning of everything, which then you realize is meaningless, but you kind of like practice this detachment. But in the Christian tradition, there is this thing called death, and death is the result of um, what the Bible calls the fall. And this fallout, where human beings, kind of tempted by this evil force called Satan, decided to try to figure things out. their own way, right? So they decide to actually be partakers of this knowledge that um of how to judge things, like to label things. And the Bible calls that the fall, right? So again, this is no simple metaphor. Uh this is deep, right? So I mean, on one hand, you can just go along with the traditional view that um the all the Bible is saying is that when Eve and Adam ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is this tree that God sort of forbade them to eat, you can just say, oh, it's a very simple act of disobedience, right? And that's why all of us need to obey God in a certain way and prescribe certain rules. But then again, as we have been returning to, we realize the ancient tradition itself is not so simple. It's talking about things like the seed and the tree and fruits. So all these things takes time, it takes assessment, it takes wisdom to discern. There's complexity in even what is good and what is evil, right? So in that sense, when man first fall, there's a kind of, I guess, trick. For me, the metaphor to me is we in humans, we have always this impulse to label and categorize the world absolutely, right? The knowledge of good and evil. So it's absolute, right? So when you act when it came to man this desire to impose this very absolute labeling of the world, um, that's a fault because we start to feel like maybe our nakedness, and that was what they felt immediately, right? That because they actually, I mean, the first human beings did not like have clothes on. I mean, even evolution tells us that, right? We evolved, so they felt they were naked and they were ashamed, right? But then God said, like, did I say that nakedness is who told you that you were actually unclothed? Like, who told you? I mean, because the animals, I mean, today go the animal kingdom, they don't feel like they're unclothed, right? They feel like it's the most natural thing for them to be in this unclothed state. But because we label everything, uh we grew up with we have this impulse to categorize the world good and bad. And you know, and I think couldn't see that invitation then to heal is to actually grow out of this immature state where we actually categorize the world in such absolute terms. So the healing then is to actually um, undo this themselves, to realize that the world is actually a connected whole, and it's life will show us that somehow, even though we quickly categorize the world as good and bad, it isn't so. It isn't that simple, right? It isn't that simple at all. So, and perhaps that is that, and not only in us, right? In the system level, the Apostle Paul said that there's some kind of um, strife going on that is tearing creation apart, right? So if you think about it, like even that, right? At the creation level, something is going on that tears. You talk about climate change, you talk about what we do to the environment, but we also talk about the environment itself disintegrating, right? So I mean, the ancients would not have, uh, studied that much about perhaps I mean, their scientific knowledge in that sense about the relation between our actions and the environment, and perhaps at that point in time, their actions also were not actually causing that much damage to the environment as our age, right? So that's one thing. There's another thing to consider. But this idea of disintegration, right? So where the earth destroys itself, correct? So where nature is being destroyed by tsunamis, and all those things. In some sense, is it is, but we are actually doing kind of like that is a metaphor of what we do to one another, right? So if it is like the tsunami looking at the forest and thinking that the forest is something that it has to consume in order to get ahead because the forest is blocking its path, right? And the forest thinking that the tsunami is something that this body of water is something that is so destructive that they would never again, you know, touch water. But water is actually essential for survival, right? So obviously the trees and the sea do not think like that, right? They see themselves as a whole, and that is why when one part suffers, scientifically we know another part suffers. For example, the whole ecosystem is linked, right? So they obviously don't see themselves in that way, but we see ourselves in that way, right? I mean, of course, you can say the prey and predator, they are wired to feed and all that, but I guess we humans have that consciousness level to actually name another person as our enemy. So we see in nature when someone does something and it seems to hurt us, that that person must be our enemy, right? So there's a very quick kind of like an action that's bad and this is our enemy, right? What is that? So probably that is what is meant by, you know, um, death. So that's death because we are pulling ourselves, the human community apart, and that's why there's wars, violence, aggression at the family level, at the company level, at the societal level, and then at international level. So we are we are dividing ourselves because we are categorizing and we are prejudiced against the other. So someone who is different from us, right? And sooner or later we realize that even our closest partner, our spouse or our friend or family is also deeply different from us, and that is why there exists very deep trauma even within families because somehow we resist difference and we kind of categorize that as uh, evil rather than trying to understand the layers that shape a person, right? And we try to police others because we think of the divine that when we think of God, we think of Him as someone that is trying to police us, right? Trying to get us in line and in a very absolutist way. So if you don't do this, you go to hell, right? Or if you do this, you go to hell. If you have premarital sex at this point, and you go to hell. So there's all that kind of thing. I mean, it's not that, I mean, I accept, I hear you if you come from that view, but I'm just saying that what's that view doing for you internally about this me versus them? I mean, of course, you can say we love the sinner, but we hate the sin. Then we need to understand the sinner a bit more deeply, why the sinner would then engage in um, premarital sex, maybe, right? And then it raises a whole lots of question like, um, what are you going to do then when you know that there are all these layers and motivation, right? Are you still going to stigmatize this behavior or what's your understanding of sin then, right? Do you think sin is something fixed about certain behaviors, or do you think even that definition is evolving, or how sin in certain, I mean, how it's manifested, how you judge should be contextualized, right? I'm not saying you have to come to a different point of view about any of these things, right? But the point is the God that you are actually kind of connected to today, um, whom you say that you're kind of like serving the will of God, because Jesus once said that, his authentic family is not the family, his immediate blood family, but it's actually the wider community that is actually pursuing God. So if we say we are that, then it's that meaningful big story that we are actually connected to that's shaping us into its image. Is it a big story that is dividing the world, or is it a big story that's reuniting the world? Are we seeing God as a God, or gods as gods who, I mean, our religion as a religion that heals and reconciles, or a religion that tears apart in the end, right? I mean, how do we see it? I mean, is the stories that we draw from for comfort, hope for our own lives, stories that are actually healing for the world? Or are they stories that at its core, uh, perhaps are full of rituals that damage the world instead, or cause the world to go into deeper dysfunction because we do not listen carefully to the stories of others. There is no place in these stories for the story of others, right? So I mean, I give some examples that even not for religious people, that you have things that actually you deem as gods, right? They are up here. Coffee. I had that here. Food promotion, dating, therapy, or discipleship programs. I mean, coaching, whatever it is, mindfulness, right? All these are stories, and in some sense, there's a kind of a God, right? That is actually mm, it informs your vision of a God. You may be an atheist, you may think that God doesn't exist, but whatever that you are actually spending a lot of your time and energy in order to draw more energy from it to motivate you in your daily life, these things are actually, in some ways, telling you about the source of I mean, the origin of the universe, right? So then, okay, there may be no God in the end, right? But these things you go through, hobbies, activities to recharge, right? Might actually, I mean, underlying it, they are subconsciously informing you or shaping you into a certain kind of person who understands the origins of the world in a certain way, if it makes sense. Which means you don't have to believe in God, but they're telling you, um, perhaps, is the world by nature a divided place? Okay? Or are they telling you the world by nature is actually a reconciled place, a place where we can actually coexist, right, with people who are different from us? Or are they at its core, for example, if you think about dating nowadays, right, apps that divide people so um, mechanically, so methodically into profession, into personality, or what have you, right? What kind of message is it telling the users about the way the world is, right? So more than just about whether you can find your potential partner or what kind of potential partner can find you, what kind of message is it telling the user that you only be loved if you are similar to the people around you, that you're only worthy of love if you're similar or you fit certain categories, right? So, or should you only, I mean, open welcome should only be given very, very scrutinizingly only to people who meet certain criteria, which means um, should everyone be deserving of love? I think the question is that. Should everyone deserve love, right? So, or are everyone's stories actually worth hearing? Yeah. So I'll leave you with that to think about it, right? What are your discipleship programs revealing about the God who created the world, right? Or the origin of it? Is it telling you that only those who meet certain requirements or who have life thought about, figured out in a certain way, interpreted in a certain way are kind of like resilient people? Yeah. Are they generous or rigid stories? But no, whatever story that you give yourself to ultimately shapes you and shapes me. So I do hope that yeah, the voice that spoke to Jesus all those years ago when he stood up to open up a welcome for sinners and and saints and everyone in between, and ultimately got himself killed for that because as we spoke about in the other podcast, right? The elites that would rather have control of societies in certain few hands rather than everyone awaking to a sense that the world can be ordered in more just ways, right? So he stood up for that. May that voice um, speak to you in your own ways today.